The supply convoy rolled through the Croatian countryside on what seemed like another routine Tuesday morning. But 23-year-old Andrea Wilson gripped the steering wheel of her cargo truck with white knuckles, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. Within minutes, sniper fire would shatter the peaceful morning, turning a simple supply run into a deadly ambush that would test everything she'd been told she wasn't capable of. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. They said she was just a driver, too emotional, too inexperienced for anything beyond hauling equipment from point A to point B. But when bullets started flying and her convoy was trapped in a kill zone with nowhere to run, Andrea Wilson would prove that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly what the situation demands. The morning briefing at Camp Marijan began at 07:00 sharp, but Andrea Wilson had been awake since 5 a.m., sitting in the mess hall nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She watched through the windows as the Croatian sun painted golden streaks across the Pannonian plains, her mind already running through the day's supply route that she could navigate blindfolded after 6 months of the same monotonous runs. At 23, Andrea stood barely 5 feet 4 inches, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she kept perpetually pulled back in regulation style. Her colleagues in the International Peacekeeping Force often described her as intense, a polite way of saying she cared too much about everything. She was the kind of person who double-checked fuel levels, memorized backup routes, and studied regional maps during her off-duty hours, not because anyone asked her to, but because preparation felt like the only thing she could control in an unpredictable environment. The briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy as she slipped inside, finding her customary spot near the back. Major Eric Johansson stood at the front, his weathered Scandinavian features serious as he addressed the assembled team. Maps covered the wall behind him, red zones marking areas of recent insurgent activity, blue lines tracing the approved convoy routes through the disputed territories. Andrea pulled out her notebook, though she already knew what was coming. She'd been running supplies to Forward Operating Base Velebit for months. The same route, the same cargo, the same dismissive attitude from her fellow peacekeepers, who saw her as nothing more than a glorified delivery driver. Today's supply run is designated Operation Sunflower, Johansson announced, his accent thick with authority. Standard route through the Medvednica corridor to FOB Velebit. Recent intelligence suggests minimal hostile activity in the area, so this should be routine. Andrea's pen hovered over her notepad as Johansson began assigning roles. Sergeant Muller, you're leading the escort vehicles. Corporal Hansen, you're his backup. Private Kowalski handles communications. The names continued, each assignment carrying the weight of trust and responsibility. Combat roles, security positions, mission-critical duties that mattered when things went wrong. Wilson, Johansson's voice cut through her thoughts. You're on supply transport, Truck 3, Standard Cargo Manifest. Make sure you stay in formation and follow protocol. Supply transport again. Andrea nodded curtly, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Around her, the selected team members exchanged confident grins and tactical discussions about vehicle positioning and communication frequencies. She might as well have been furniture for all the strategic input she was expected to provide. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach clench with familiar frustration. Good thing Wilson's just driving, she heard Private Kowalski mutter to his partner. No offense, but when things get complicated, you want someone who doesn't get all emotional under pressure. She's competent enough, Sergeant Muller replied dismissively, but there's a reason they put her in the back of the convoy. Keep the important stuff up front, where the real soldiers can handle it. Andrea pretended not to hear, but the words stung because they echoed every conversation she'd endured for the past 6 months. Too emotional, too inexperienced, too much of a liability when situations required real military expertise. It didn't matter that she could strip down a truck engine and rebuild it in the dark, or that she'd scored higher than most of her unit on tactical driving courses. When it came to missions that mattered, she was always relegated to the background. The worst part was understanding their reasoning on some level. Peacekeeping operations required split-second decisions under extreme pressure, and her colleagues had seen her tear up during particularly difficult refugee evacuations. They'd witnessed her struggle with the emotional weight of seeing displaced families, had heard her voice crack when reporting casualty numbers. In their minds, emotional investment was a weakness, a liability that could compromise mission effectiveness. But what they interpreted as weakness, Andrea knew was actually strength. Her emotional connection to the mission made her more observant, more invested in getting everyone home safely. She noticed details that others missed, studied scenarios that others dismissed, prepared for contingencies that others assumed would never happen. As the convoy prepared for departure, Andrea walked to the motor pool and began her pre-flight inspection of Transport 3, a heavy-duty cargo truck loaded with medical supplies, ammunition, and food rations for the forward base. Hidden beneath her regulation equipment was a detailed tactical map she'd been working on for weeks, marking every potential ambush point, every escape route, every piece of high ground within 50 kilometers of their planned route. Nobody had asked her to create this map. Nobody knew she spent her evenings analyzing after-action reports from other convoys, studying the terrain with the intensity of a combat planner rather than a simple driver. But Andrea had learned that being ready for opportunity, or in this case, disaster, was the only way to prove that emotional investment and tactical competence weren't mutually exclusive. The convoy assembled at 0800 hours, 6 vehicles in total, 2 armored escorts at the front, 3 supply trucks in the middle, and 1 trailing security vehicle. Andrea took her position third in line, exactly where someone too emotional for real responsibility belonged. She watched through her mirrors as the base gates opened, revealing the peaceful Croatian countryside that would soon become a battlefield. As they rolled out into the morning sunshine, Andrea adjusted her radio headset and settled in for what everyone expected to be another routine supply run. She had no way of knowing that within 2 hours her 6 months of preparation and her supposedly problematic emotional investment would be the only thing standing between her convoy and total disaster. The convoy moved through the Croatian countryside like a mechanical snake, 6 vehicles maintaining perfect spacing along the winding road that cut through rolling hills, dotted with abandoned farmhouses and overgrown fields. Andrea kept Transport 3 positioned exactly 50 meters behind Sergeant Mueller's lead truck, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain while maintaining radio discipline with crisp, professional check-ins every 10 minutes. The morning had started clear and warm, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the whole world seem peaceful and manageable. Through her windshield, Andrea could see wildflowers blooming along the roadside, their bright colors a stark contrast to the military green of the convoy vehicles. It should have been beautiful, but something felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. 3 weeks had passed since the last incident in this sector, a roadside explosive that had damaged a humanitarian convoy without causing casualties. The intelligence briefing had classified the threat level as minimal, noting that insurgent activity had shifted to areas further south. But Andrea's instincts, honed by months of studying patrol reports and incident analyses, were telling a different story. She'd first noticed it during the pre-mission briefing, when Major Johansson had seemed almost dismissive of the security protocols. The route they were taking passed through what locals called the Quiet Valley, a stretch of road that had been incident-free for nearly 2 months. But that statistical calm was exactly what worried her. In her evening studies of regional conflict patterns, she'd observed that insurgent groups often allowed extended periods of normal activity before launching coordinated attacks. "Convoy base, this is Transport 3, she radioed, her voice steady despite the growing unease. "All systems normal, maintaining formation." "Copy that, Transport 3, came Mueller's reply from the lead vehicle. "ETA to Checkpoint Alpha is 20 minutes, weather's holding, traffic's light, should be smooth sailing from here." Andrea wanted to key her radio and share her concerns about the suspicious absence of civilian traffic, along a route that was usually busy with local farmers and merchants. She wanted to mention that the small village they'd passed through 15 minutes ago had seemed unusually quiet, with too many windows shuttered for a normal Tuesday morning. But she also knew that expressing tactical concerns was outside her designated role as a supply driver. "We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated." Now, let's return to the narrative. Instead, she maintained radio silence and continued her constant visual sweep of the surrounding terrain. The road ahead curved through a narrow valley with steep hills on both sides. Exactly the kind of terrain that military tacticians called a natural kill zone. Her detailed map, folded discreetly beside her seat, showed at least 6 positions from which hostile forces could observe and engage passing convoys. The irony wasn't lost on her that everyone considered her too emotional for combat roles, while she was probably the only person in the convoy who had actually analyzed the tactical vulnerabilities of their current route. Her supposedly problematic attention to detail had led her to identify 17 potential ambush sites between Camp Marijan and Fob Velebit, complete with recommended evasive maneuvers and fallback positions. "Transport 3, this is Escort 2, came a voice from the trailing security vehicle. "You're drifting left. Maintain centerline positioning." "Copy, Escort 2, Andrea replied, making a minor steering correction. The criticism stung because she'd actually been adjusting her position to maintain better sightlines around the curve ahead, but tactical driving considerations weren't something she was expected to communicate. As they approached the narrowest part of the valley, Andrea's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The hills rose steeply on both sides, covered with dense vegetation that could easily conceal hostile positions. Her map indicated that this particular stretch offered minimal escape routes. Once committed to the valley, the convoy would have no choice but to continue forward or reverse back along the same exposed road. Through her earpiece, she monitored the routine chatter between the escort vehicles. Casual conversation about weekend leave, complaints about mess hall food, speculation about when they'd rotate back to their home countries. Normal peacekeeping banter that revealed how completely relaxed everyone had become about what should have been a high-risk transit through disputed territory. Andrea checked her mirrors and noticed that the trailing escort vehicle had fallen back slightly, creating a gap in the convoy formation. In her tactical studies, she'd learned that insurgent groups often targeted convoys at their most vulnerable points, exactly when security protocols became relaxed and spacing discipline deteriorated. "Convoy base, this is Transport 3, she keyed her radio. "Escort 2 has extended following distance beyond recommended parameters." There was a pause before Muller's reply came through, tinged with mild irritation. "Transport 3, maintain radio discipline. Escort 2 is within acceptable range." The rebuke felt like a slap, but Andrea forced herself to focus on driving rather than the familiar sting of having her observations dismissed. She was just a supply driver, after all, not qualified to make tactical assessments or security recommendations. Her job was to deliver cargo and follow orders, not to question the judgment of more experienced peacekeepers. But as they approached the deepest part of the valley, where the road curved sharply between two wooded hills, Andrea's combat instincts that nobody believed she possessed, began screaming warnings that she couldn't ignore. The silence was too complete, the spacing too irregular, the terrain too perfect for an ambush. She glanced at her tactical map one more time, noting the red circles she'd drawn around high ground positions that offered commanding views of the road. In less than 2 minutes, the convoy would be completely exposed in the valley floor with nowhere to run and limited ability to maneuver. Andrea took a deep breath and made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She was about to prove that being too emotional for combat roles didn't mean being unprepared for combat situations. Andrea's premonition materialized with the sharp crack of a rifle shot that shattered the peaceful morning like broken glass. The bullet struck the windshield of Muller's led vehicle, spider-webbing the reinforced glass and sending the convoy into immediate chaos. Through her radio, she heard Muller's shocked voice, "Contact front, sniper fire from the ridge line." The convoy's response was textbook but catastrophic. Both escort vehicles immediately accelerated toward what they assumed was a single shooter position on the eastern ridge, leaving the 3 supply trucks exposed and vulnerable in the middle of the valley floor. Andrea watched in horror as Transport 1 and Transport 2 followed the escorts, bunching together in a classic tactical error that made them perfect targets for a coordinated ambush. "All vehicles maintain spacing," she shouted into her radio, but her warning was lost in the cacophony of overlapping transmissions as everyone tried to talk at once. The careful convoy formation that had taken months to drill dissolved in seconds, replaced by the kind of panic response that insurgent groups specifically planned their attacks to create. That's when the real ambush began. Muzzle flashes erupted from at least 6 different positions across both ridgelines, creating a devastating crossfire that turned the narrow valley into a killing zone. The insurgents had waited for the convoy to reach the most vulnerable point before opening fire from concealed positions that Andrea's tactical map had identified weeks ago. Her worst fears were being realized in real time. Multiple shooters! Multiple shooters! Muller's voice cracked with stress as his vehicle took hits from several directions simultaneously. We're taking heavy fire from elevated positions. Andrea slammed on her brakes as the vehicles ahead of her suddenly stopped, their drivers either wounded or seeking cover behind their trucks. Transport 2's rear tires exploded under sniper fire, sending the heavy vehicle skidding sideways across the road and completely blocking the convoy's forward progress. Behind her, she could hear the trailing escort vehicle taking hits as it tried to reverse back toward the valley entrance. The situation went from bad to catastrophic in less than 30 seconds. The convoy was stopped dead in the middle of the kill zone, taking accurate fire from multiple concealed positions, with no clear escape route and rapidly deteriorating communication. Through her side mirror, Andrea could see Private Kowalski slumped over the wheel of Transport 2, blood streaming down his face from a head wound. Convoy base, this is Escort 2, came a panicked transmission. Engines hit! We're immobilized! Request immediate support! But there was no support coming. The nearest backup unit was 40 minutes away, and the insurgents had clearly planned this ambush to maximize casualties before any reinforcements could arrive. Andrea realized with crystal clarity that her convoy was about to be completely destroyed unless someone took immediate action to change the tactical situation. She grabbed her radio with one hand while simultaneously studying her tactical map with the other. All vehicles, this is Transport 3. The enemy positions are exactly where intelligence predicted they would be. We need to break contact immediately. Transport 3, maintain radio discipline. Mueller snapped back, his voice strained with stress and wounded authority. I'm coordinating the response. But Muller's coordination consisted of ordering the remaining mobile vehicles to seek cover behind the disabled trucks, effectively concentrating all their forces in a single location where the insurgents could destroy them methodically. Andrea watched in disbelief as her fellow peacekeepers made every tactical mistake that her evening study sessions had taught her to avoid. Another volley of sniper fire shredded the radio antenna on Transport 1, cutting off half their communications. Through her windshield, Andrea could see Hansen trying to drag the wounded Kowalski to safety while taking fire from at least 3 different angles. The young soldier was completely exposed, trying to save his friend while insurgent bullets kicked up dirt around his boots. Andrea made a decision that would have been considered insubordination under normal circumstances, but nothing about being trapped in a kill zone was normal. She keyed her radio one more time. All vehicles, I'm going to create a distraction. When I move, everyone else needs to execute emergency evasion maneuvers according to Convoy Protocol 7. Transport 3, you will maintain position, Mueller ordered. That's a direct order. But Andrea was already shifting into gear, her mind racing through the tactical options she'd studied obsessively during her supposedly inappropriate map sessions. The insurgents had positioned themselves to target a stationary convoy, but they hadn't anticipated a supply truck suddenly breaking formation and creating chaos in their carefully planned ambush. She gunned Transport 3's engine and swerved hard left, leaving the road entirely and crashing through a wooden fence into an abandoned farm field. The heavy truck bounced violently over rough terrain as sniper bullets whined past her windows, but her sudden movement had achieved exactly what she'd hoped for. The insurgents were forced to adjust their fire, tracking her movement instead of concentrating on the stationary targets. In that crucial moment of distraction, Hansen managed to drag Kowalski behind cover, and the remaining mobile vehicles began executing the evasive maneuvers that should have been implemented the moment the ambush began. Through her rearview mirror, Andrea could see Transport 1 successfully reversing back toward the valley entrance, while Escort 1 provided covering fire from a new position. Her desperate gambit was working, but she was now completely isolated in an open field, taking concentrated fire from multiple positions, with nowhere to hide and no support. The radio crackled with Muller's voice, no longer dismissive but genuinely shocked. Transport 3, what are you doing? Andrea gripped the steering wheel tighter as bullets shattered her passenger window, spraying safety glass across the cab. I'm saving the convoy, sir, she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Just like I've been preparing to do for the past 6 months. Andrea's truck bounced violently across the rough farmland as she fought to maintain control while sniper bullets punched holes through her cargo bay. The insurgents had clearly been surprised by her sudden movement, but they were adapting quickly, concentrating their fire on the isolated vehicle that had disrupted their carefully planned ambush. She could hear the metallic ping of rounds hitting her truck's armored panels, each impact a reminder of how thin the line was between survival and disaster. Through her fractured windshield, she spotted what her tactical map had indicated would be there, a stone farmhouse about 200 meters ahead, positioned at the base of the western ridge. It was abandoned, partially collapsed, but it offered the only solid cover in the open field where she now found herself trapped. More importantly, it would put her close enough to the insurgent positions to do something that no one expected a simple supply driver to attempt. Transport 3, return to the convoy immediately, Muller's voice crackled through her radio, mixing authority with genuine concern. You're isolated and taking heavy fire. Negative, Convoy Base, Andrea replied, yanking the steering wheel hard right to avoid a burst of automatic weapons fire that chewed up the ground where she'd been driving seconds before. I'm going to neutralize the western positions. Continue your withdrawal without me. The silence that followed her transmission was deafening. Through the chaos of the ambush, she'd just announced her intention to single-handedly assault entrenched insurgent positions, something that violated every protocol about staying within assigned roles and capabilities. But Andrea had spent months studying asymmetric warfare tactics, learning how unexpected actions could create decisive advantages in situations where conventional approaches failed. She reached the farmhouse and drove Transport 3 directly through what remained of the front wall, using the heavy truck as both cover and weapon. The impact scattered debris and created a cloud of dust that temporarily obscured her position from the snipers on the ridge above. For the first time since the ambush began, she had a few seconds to think and plan, instead of simply reacting. Andrea grabbed her radio and switched to an emergency frequency that bypassed normal convoy communications. Any station, this is Peacekeeping Transport 3. We have a convoy under heavy fire in the Medvednica Valley. Multiple casualties, requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation. While waiting for a response, she opened her cargo bay and began extracting equipment that nobody knew she'd requisitioned for exactly this type of situation. Hidden beneath the medical supplies and food rations were smoke grenades, signal flares, and a tactical radio system that could coordinate with aircraft and artillery units. Her fellow peacekeepers saw unauthorized equipment acquisition as rule-breaking. Andrea saw it as mission preparation. The insurgents on the western ridge had repositioned to target her new location, and she could hear bullets striking the farmhouse walls with increasing accuracy. But her tactical map had shown her something they probably didn't know. The abandoned farmhouse sat directly beneath a communications tower that was still partially functional. If she could reach it, she could call in precise coordinates for the air support that was surely en route. Transport 3, this is Air Support Delta, came a voice through her tactical radio. We copy your emergency transmission. Apache gunships are 15 minutes out. Can you provide target coordinates? Andrea smiled grimly as she checked her GPS unit and consulted her detailed terrain map. Air Support Delta, I can do better than coordinates. I can provide real-time target designation if you can follow my instructions. Quote, what happened next would be studied in tactical manuals for years afterward. Using smoke grenades to mask her movement, Andrea left the relative safety of the farmhouse and began climbing the damaged communications tower, carrying her tactical radio and a laser designator she'd borrowed from the base armory weeks earlier. The insurgents could see her movement but couldn't get clear shots through the smoke and debris. As she climbed, she maintained constant radio contact with both the incoming air support and the convoy vehicles that were still extracting from the kill zone. Convoy Base, this is Transport 3. I have visual on 6 sniper positions on the eastern ridge and at least 4 more on the western slope, transmitting coordinates now. From her elevated position, Andrea could see the entire tactical situation with stunning clarity. The insurgents had indeed planned a sophisticated ambush, positioning their shooters to create overlapping fields of fire that would have destroyed any convoy that followed standard protocols. But they hadn't planned for a supply driver who would abandon her vehicle, assault their positions, and call in airstrikes with the precision of a forward observer. Muller's voice came through her radio, no longer commanding but almost pleading. Transport 3, get down from there. You're completely exposed. Negative, Convoy Base, Andrea replied, adjusting her laser designator to paint targets for the incoming gunships. I have the best observation point in the valley. I'm staying here until everyone's safe." Through her binoculars, she could see the convoy vehicles successfully reaching the valley entrance, with Hansen providing first aid to the wounded Kowalski while maintaining security. Her desperate gambit had worked. The convoy was escaping, but she was now alone on a communications tower, surrounded by increasingly angry insurgents who realized their ambush had been completely disrupted by a single soldier they'd underestimated. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Andrea began the delicate process of talking two Apache gunships onto targets that were actively shooting at her. Air Support Delta, target designation Alpha, is the cluster of rocks at grid reference 847 to 239. 3 shooters with sniper rifles. Target designation Bravo is the tree line at reference 851 to 241. Automatic weapons position. Copy. Transport 3. We have your designations. Engaging now. Quote, the valley erupted in explosions as precision-guided missiles struck the insurgent positions with devastating accuracy. Andrea's detailed knowledge of the terrain, combined with her elevated observation point, allowed her to direct fire with surgical precision that neutralized threats while avoiding collateral damage to the surrounding civilian areas. But the insurgents weren't finished. Several fighters had left their elevated positions and were advancing on the farmhouse, intending to capture or kill the lone soldier who had destroyed their carefully planned operation. Andrea could see them moving through the smoke and debris, and she realized that her tactical radio had made her the primary target for everyone who remained alive in the valley. The insurgents approached the farmhouse with the practiced coordination of experienced fighters, using smoke and debris for concealment as they closed the distance to Andrea's position. From her perch on the communications tower, she could count at least 8 fighters moving in from multiple directions, their automatic weapons ready for the close-quarters combat that would determine whether her desperate gambit had saved the convoy or merely delayed the inevitable. Air Support Delta, this is Transport 3, she radioed, watching the approaching fighters through her binoculars. I have multiple hostiles converging on my position. Grid reference 849 to 240, danger close engagement requested. Negative, Transport 3, came the pilot's response. You're too close to the target zone. We can't engage without risking friendly fire. Andrea realized with cold clarity that she was about to face the kind of direct combat that everyone had insisted she was unsuited for. No backup, no support, no escape route. Just her against 8 seasoned insurgents who intended to make her pay for disrupting their ambush. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to test whether being too emotional for combat roles meant being inadequate for actual combat. She scrambled down from the communications tower as quickly as possible, reaching the farmhouse just as the first insurgent rounded the corner of the building. The fighter raised his weapon, but Andrea was faster, having anticipated his approach from her elevated observation point. Her service pistol barked twice, and the insurgent dropped, his rifle clattering across the stone floor. The engagement that followed would later be described by military analysts as a textbook example of how superior tactical knowledge could overcome numerical disadvantage. Andrea used her detailed understanding of the farmhouse layout, information she'd gathered from studying satellite imagery, to create a series of ambush points that forced the insurgents to attack her 1 or 2 at a time, rather than as a coordinated group. She moved through the ruined building like a ghost, using her small size and intimate knowledge of the terrain to her advantage. While the insurgents searched for her with increasing frustration, she systematically eliminated them using tactics that combined precision shooting with psychological warfare. Her radio remained active throughout the engagement, providing real-time updates to the Apache gunships circling overhead. Air Support Delta, 2 hostiles eliminated at the north entrance, 3 more approaching from the eastern wall. I'm moving to position Charlie. Her voice remained steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system, years of emotional discipline finally paying dividends in the most extreme situation imaginable. The insurgents began to realize they were hunting someone far more dangerous than a simple supply driver. Their communications, intercepted by Andrea's tactical radio, revealed growing confusion and concern about the lone soldier who seemed to anticipate their every move. What they didn't understand was that she'd spent months studying exactly this type of scenario, preparing for the kind of close-quarters combat that her superiors assumed she'd never encounter. The turning point came when 3 insurgents attempted a coordinated assault on the farmhouse's main room. Andrea had positioned herself behind a stone wall that offered both cover and multiple escape routes, forcing them to expose themselves as they advanced. Her carefully planned crossfire eliminated 2 of them immediately, while the third fighter retreated in panic, shouting warnings to his remaining comrades about the demon who was systematically destroying their force. "Transport 3, this is Convoy Base," Mueller's voice crackled through her radio. "Status report. Are you still alive?" "Affirmative, Convoy Base," Andrea replied while reloading her pistol and checking her remaining ammunition. 5 hostiles eliminated, approximately 3 still active. "I'm maintaining position and calling targets for air support." Quote. The silence that followed her report spoke volumes. Her fellow peacekeepers were struggling to process the reality that their dismissed supply driver had single-handedly engaged and defeated a superior force of experienced insurgents. The woman they'd considered too emotional for combat roles was systematically dismantling an enemy unit with the kind of tactical precision that elite special forces would have admired. The remaining insurgents made one final desperate attempt to overwhelm her position, launching a coordinated assault from 2 directions while laying down suppressing fire with their automatic weapons. But Andrea had anticipated this exact scenario, using smoke grenades to obscure their vision while repositioning to a prepared fighting position that offered perfect sightlines to both approach routes. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 3 more insurgents lay motionless around the farmhouse, and the valley had fallen completely silent except for the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Andrea emerged from cover cautiously, her weapon ready, scanning for any remaining threats while maintaining radio contact with the circling air support. "Air Support Delta, this is Transport 3. All hostile contacts eliminated. Area secure for convoy recovery operations." "Copy that, Transport 3. That was impressive work down there. We're setting up a perimeter while medical evacuation inbound." Andrea holstered her weapon and walked back toward her damaged truck, her mind already shifting from combat mode to the logistical challenges of convoy recovery. 8 insurgents had been eliminated, the ambush had been completely disrupted, and her convoy was safe. But she was also acutely aware that she just crossed a line that would fundamentally change how everyone viewed her capabilities. As she waited for the recovery helicopters, Andrea reflected on the conversation she'd have with Major Johansson when she returned to base. Her unauthorized actions had saved lives and eliminated a significant insurgent threat, but they'd also violated numerous protocols about staying within assigned roles and chain of command. She'd proven that emotional investment and tactical competence weren't mutually exclusive, but she'd done it by ignoring direct orders and engaging in combat far beyond her supposed qualifications. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Andrea began preparing for extraction. She'd started the day as a dismissed supply driver who was considered too emotional for real responsibility. She was ending it as someone who would never be underestimated again. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris 40 minutes after Andrea's radio call had shattered the morning calm in the Medvednica Valley. As the rotors wound down, she could see a full recovery team deploying from multiple aircraft, combat medics, security personnel, and investigators who would spend the next several hours trying to understand how a single supply driver had transformed a devastating ambush into a tactical victory. Private Kowalski was loaded onto the first helicopter, his head wound stabilized but requiring immediate surgery at the base hospital. As the stretcher passed Andrea's position, he grabbed her arm with surprising strength, his eyes focused despite his injuries. "Wilson?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the aircraft noise. "Thank you. You saved us all." Andrea nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude from someone who'd questioned her emotional fitness for military service just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her that her supposedly problematic emotional investment in her fellow soldiers' welfare had been the driving force behind every decision she'd made during the crisis. Major Johansson arrived on the second helicopter, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the aftermath of the engagement. 8 insurgent bodies lay scattered around the farmhouse, their weapons and equipment being cataloged by intelligence specialists. Transport 3 sat partially buried in the collapsed wall of the building, its cargo bay riddled with bullet holes but its essential systems still functional. "Wilson," Johansson called, approaching her position near the communications tower she'd used to coordinate the airstrikes. "I need a complete after-action report. everything that happened from initial contact until area was secured. Andrea straightened to attention, suddenly conscious of how her uniform had been torn and stained during the firefight. Sir, at approximately 0847 hours, the convoy came under sniper fire from multiple positions on both ridge lines. Initial response protocols failed to break contact effectively, resulting in vehicle damage and casualties. And your decision to leave formation? Johansson's tone was carefully neutral, but Andrea could sense the investigation that was already beginning behind his questions. Sir, I assessed that standard convoy protocols were inadequate for the tactical situation. The insurgents had positioned themselves to exploit our predictable response patterns. Breaking formation and creating a distraction was necessary to allow other vehicles to execute evasive maneuvers. Johansson consulted his notes, comparing her account with radio transcripts and statements from other convoy members. Sergeant Muller reports that you ignored direct orders to maintain position and instead initiated unauthorized combat operations. Yes, sir, Andrea replied. I determined that following orders would result in the destruction of the entire convoy. I made a tactical decision to prioritize mission success over protocol compliance. The investigation continued for nearly 2 hours as various specialists examined the ambush site, interviewed survivors, and reconstructed the engagement from multiple perspectives. What emerged was a picture of tactical improvisation that had transformed certain disaster into decisive victory, but had also violated virtually every protocol about chain of command and role limitations. Captain Elizabeth Thornton from the Inspector General's office conducted the formal interview, her questions probing not just Andrea's actions, but her motivations and preparation. Specialist Wilson, your tactical knowledge appears to exceed what would be expected for someone in a logistics role. Can you explain how you acquired familiarity with advanced combat procedures? Andrea had known this moment would come, when her months of unauthorized study and preparation would be scrutinized by military investigators. Ma'am, I studied after-action reports, terrain analyses, and tactical manuals during my off-duty hours. I believed that understanding potential threats would make me more effective in my assigned role. But you also acquired unauthorized equipment, created detailed tactical maps, and prepared for scenarios far beyond your official responsibilities, Thornton continued. Some might characterize this as inappropriate ambition, or failure to focus on assigned duties. Ma'am, I believe that being prepared for contingencies was part of being a good soldier, Andrea replied. Recent events suggest that my preparation was justified. Quote, the formal questioning lasted until late afternoon, but the unofficial conversations that followed were more revealing. Sergeant Muller, his arm in a sling from shrapnel wounds, approached Andrea as the investigation team prepared to return to base. Wilson, I owe you an apology, he said quietly. We all do. You saved my life today, and I spent 6 months telling people you weren't qualified for anything more than driving trucks. Other convoy members offered similar acknowledgments, their words carrying the weight of men who'd had their assumptions about capability and courage fundamentally challenged. Hansen, who dragged Kowalski to safety during the initial ambush, was particularly direct. I've been wrong about you from day one. You're a better soldier than most of us, and we were too stupid to see it. But Andrea also sensed the underlying tension that her actions had created. By succeeding so dramatically outside her assigned role, she'd challenged the entire system that determined who was suitable for various military responsibilities. Her emotional investment, the quality that had made her colleagues uncomfortable, had proven to be exactly what the situation required. As the convoy loaded onto transport helicopters for the return to Camp Marijan, Andrea found herself sitting alone, processing the magnitude of what had occurred. She'd started the day as a dismissed supply driver who was considered too emotional for a real military responsibility. She was ending it as someone who would never be categorized so simply again. The flight back to base took 20 minutes, but Andrea knew that the real journey was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring formal reviews, official recognition, and conversations about her future role in the peacekeeping force. But tonight, she was content with the knowledge that when everything had gone wrong, her preparation and determination had been enough to bring everyone home safely. The helicopter banked toward Camp Marijan as the sun set over the Croatian countryside, its golden light painting the same peaceful landscape that had concealed such violence just hours earlier. Andrea watched through the window and smiled quietly, knowing that she'd proven something important about the relationship between emotional strength and tactical effectiveness. Some battles were won with overwhelming force, but others required the kind of persistent preparation and unwavering commitment that her colleagues had mistaken for inappropriate ambition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, everyone was going home safely, and that was exactly what she'd been preparing for all along. The formal debriefing began at 0600 the following morning in Camp Marijan's main conference room, but Andrea had been awake since 3 a.m., unable to sleep as she processed the previous day's events. She stood outside the briefing room, watching through the window as officers from multiple commands gathered around tables covered with maps, photographs, and preliminary investigation reports. The weight of scrutiny felt heavier than the combat gear she'd worn during the firefight. Inside, she could see Major Johansson speaking with Colonel Patricia Voss, the regional peacekeeping commander who'd flown in specifically to investigate the Medvednica Valley incident. Their body language suggested intense discussion about protocol violations and unprecedented tactical success, two concepts that military bureaucracy struggled to reconcile. Andrea knew that her actions had created a problem that extended far beyond simple rule-breaking. Wilson. Sergeant Muller approached from behind, his arm still immobilized in a medical sling. They've been in there for 2 hours already. Word is that some people are calling for commendations, while others are pushing for disciplinary action. Andrea turned to face him, noting how differently he looked at her now compared to their interactions before the ambush. The dismissive condescension had been replaced by something approaching genuine respect, but also uncertainty about how to interact with someone who'd shattered his assumptions about military capability. "What's your assessment, Sergeant?" "Honestly, I think you saved all our lives. But you also scared the hell out of everyone who's supposed to make decisions about assignments and promotions." Muller shifted uncomfortably. "Nobody knows how to categorize what you did. It doesn't fit into any of the usual boxes." The conference room door opened, and Captain Thornton emerged to summon Andrea inside. As she entered, the conversation stopped, and 12 sets of eyes focused on her with varying degrees of curiosity, admiration, and concern. The formal investigation had clearly expanded into something much larger than a routine after-action review. "Specialist Wilson," Colonel Voss began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. "Your actions yesterday have generated considerable discussion at multiple command levels. Before we proceed, I want to understand your perspective on what occurred." Andrea had rehearsed this moment mentally throughout her sleepless night, knowing that her response would shape not just her own future, but potentially the policies that governed how military personnel were assigned and evaluated. "Ma'am, I believe the situation required immediate action to prevent catastrophic losses. I used my training and preparation to execute the most effective response available." "Training that exceeded your assigned role," Thornton interjected. "Preparation that violated protocols about equipment acquisition and study materials. You essentially created your own special operations curriculum without authorization." "Yes, ma'am," Andrea replied. "I believed that being thoroughly prepared would make me more effective in any situation that might arise." Colonel Voss consulted her notes, then looked directly at Andrea with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal curiosity. "Wilson, multiple witnesses report that you demonstrated tactical knowledge and combat skills that rival those of personnel with years of specialized training. How do we reconcile this with your official designation as a logistics specialist?" The question struck at the heart of the military's classification system, which assumed that roles and capabilities were fixed categories rather than dynamic potentials. Andrea chose her words carefully. "Ma'am, I believe that dedication and preparation can develop capabilities beyond official training programs. My emotional investment in mission success motivated me to acquire skills that proved essential when conventional approaches failed." "Emotional investment," Major Johansson repeated, his tone suggesting he was wrestling with concepts that challenged his traditional understanding of military effectiveness. "Yesterday, some personnel expressed concerns about your emotional responses to difficult situations. Today, we're discussing how those same emotional qualities contributed to tactical success." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the regional command leaned forward, his expression serious. "Wilson, your actions saved lives and eliminated a significant insurgent threat, but they also raised questions about military discipline and chain of command. If every soldier decided independently which orders to follow, we'd have chaos rather than effective operations. Andrea had anticipated this criticism and prepared her response carefully. Sir, I didn't disregard orders lightly. I made a tactical assessment that following standard protocols would result in the destruction of the convoy. I prioritized mission success and the preservation of life over strict adherence to procedures that were inadequate for the situation. The room fell silent as the assembled officers processed her response. Through the window, Andrea could see other personnel going about their normal duties, unaware that the conversation occurring in this conference room might fundamentally change how the military evaluated individual potential and role assignments. Captain Thornton spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of institutional concern. Wilson, your success raises uncomfortable questions about our assessment and assignment procedures. If someone with your capabilities was relegated to logistics duties, how many other personnel might be inadequately utilized? The question hung in the air like smoke, highlighting the systemic implications of Andrea's individual actions. She'd proven that emotional engagement and tactical excellence weren't mutually exclusive, but she'd also exposed flaws in the evaluation process that determine military assignments and career paths. Colonel Voss finally broke the silence. Wilson, what you accomplished yesterday was extraordinary, but extraordinary actions create extraordinary consequences. We need to determine whether you're an exceptional individual who succeeded despite system limitations, or whether our entire approach to personnel evaluation needs fundamental revision. Andrea straightened her shoulders, knowing that her response would shape not just her own future but potentially influence policy changes that affected thousands of military personnel. Ma'am, I believe that thorough preparation, emotional investment, and tactical flexibility are qualities that can be developed by anyone willing to exceed minimum requirements. Yesterday's success wasn't luck or exceptional talent. It was the result of months of dedicated study and preparation that nobody asked for but everyone benefited from. Quote, the formal session continued for another hour, with detailed questions about her tactical decisions, unauthorized equipment acquisition, and study methods. But Andrea sensed that the real decision had already been made. She'd proven something that military bureaucracy would struggle to ignore, that the relationship between assigned roles and actual capabilities was far more fluid than official policies acknowledged. As the debriefing concluded, Colonel Voss made a final observation that would echo through Andrea's mind for years afterward. Wilson, yesterday you transformed from a supply driver into a combat leader in the span of a few hours. The question we need to answer is whether that transformation represents personal growth, or simply the revelation of capabilities that were always present but never properly recognized. 3 days after the Medvednica Valley incident, Andrea found herself caught in a bureaucratic storm that made the insurgent ambush seem straightforward by comparison. Her actions had triggered a review process that extended from local command all the way to peacekeeping headquarters in Geneva, with each level of authority interpreting her unauthorized combat engagement through different philosophical and political lenses. The controversy began when international media picked up the story of a, quote, supply driver who became a one-woman army, transforming Andrea's tactical improvisation into a human interest narrative that highlighted both the heroism of individual peacekeepers and the organizational failures that had nearly resulted in catastrophe. News organizations throughout Europe were requesting interviews, while military analysts debated the implications of her success for standard operating procedures. This is getting out of hand, Major Johansson told her during their daily briefing meeting. Brussels wants a complete review of our personnel assignment protocols. The Americans are asking for tactical analysis of your engagement. The insurgents' home organization has put a bounty on your head because you embarrassed them so thoroughly. Andrea sat across from his desk, still processing the surreal transformation from overlooked logistics specialist to international celebrity. Sir, I just did what needed to be done. I didn't anticipate this level of attention. That's part of the problem, Johansson replied, shuffling through stacks of correspondence from various military and political organizations. Your success makes everyone else look incompetent. Mahler's wondering why his years of experience didn't prepare him as well as your unauthorized study sessions. Command is questioning why they assign their most capable soldier to driving trucks. The whole system is experiencing what the psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The political implications extended beyond military circles. European Union officials were highlighting Andrea's story as an example of how individual initiative could overcome institutional limitations, while critics used the same narrative to argue that peacekeeping operations were inadequately planned and executed. Her unauthorized actions had become a lightning rod for broader debates about military effectiveness and bureaucratic flexibility. Captain Thornton entered the office carrying a folder thick with official correspondence. "Wilson, we've received formal requests from 6 different military institutions asking you to speak about tactical improvisation and adaptive leadership. The War College wants to study your preparation methods. Special Operations Command is interested in your psychological profile." "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand why everyone's so interested," Andrea replied honestly. "I studied maps and acquired equipment because I thought it might be useful. When the situation required action, I acted. It doesn't seem complicated enough to warrant this level of analysis." Thornton and Johansson exchanged glances that suggested they'd been having similar conversations throughout the week. "Wilson, the complicated part isn't what you did," Thornton explained. "It's what your success implies about everyone else's failure to recognize and utilize your capabilities. You've accidentally exposed systematic problems that some people would prefer to ignore." The personal cost of unwanted fame was becoming apparent in her daily interactions with fellow personnel. Some colleagues treated her with newfound respect that felt more like awe than genuine acceptance. Others seemed resentful that her success had highlighted their own limitations or institutional blind spots. The easy camaraderie she'd enjoyed with her unit had been replaced by careful conversations weighted with unspoken implications. Rachel Morgan, one of the few friends who still treated her normally, joined her for coffee in the mess hall that afternoon. "How are you handling all this attention?" she asked, keeping her voice low to avoid eavesdropping from nearby tables. "It's strange," Andrea admitted. 3 weeks ago, nobody listened to my suggestions about convoy security. Now, everyone wants to know my opinion about strategic planning and leadership development. I'm the same person with the same knowledge, but suddenly everyone's interested because I proved it worked." "Maybe that's the point," Rachel suggested. "Maybe proving it worked was the only way to get anyone to listen. How many other people have good ideas that get ignored because they don't have the right job title or the right background?" The observation highlighted the systemic issues that Andrea's success had inadvertently exposed. Military organizations prided themselves on meritocracy and effectiveness, but her experience demonstrated how easily capable individuals could be overlooked when they didn't fit conventional expectations about competence and authority. That evening, Colonel Voss summoned Andrea for a private conversation that would determine her immediate future. They met in the colonel's temporary office, a converted storage room that reflected the hastily arranged nature of the expanding investigation into Medvednica Valley's implications. "Wilson, I've spent 30 years in military service," Voss began, "and I've never encountered a situation quite like this. Your tactical success is undeniable, but your methods challenge fundamental assumptions about chain of command and role specialization." Andrea waited, sensing that this conversation would be more significant than the formal debriefing she'd endured throughout the week. Colonel Voss had a reputation for directness that cut through political considerations to address practical realities. "The problem," Voss continued, "is that your success makes everyone else look either incompetent or unimaginative. Muller's been a convoy leader for 5 years, but he didn't anticipate the tactical problems that you'd studied extensively. Command assigned their most prepared soldier to the least important job. The insurgents planned an ambush that should have been devastating, but they didn't account for someone who'd studied their likely positions and prepared appropriate responses." "Ma'am, I think the real problem is that people assume emotional investment and tactical competence are incompatible," Andrea replied. "My colleagues interpreted my attention to detail and concern for mission success as weaknesses rather than strengths." Colonel Voss nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what makes this situation so complicated. You've proven that our evaluation methods might be fundamentally flawed. If we missed your capabilities so completely, how many other personnel are inadequately utilized?" The question carried implications that extended far beyond Andrea's individual case. Military effectiveness depended on matching personnel capabilities with mission requirements, but her experience suggested that the matching process was based on incomplete assessments and limiting assumptions about who could excel in various roles. "Wilson, I'm going to make you an offer," Voss said finally, "but I want you to understand the full implications before you decide. We're creating a new position that will allow you to develop and teach the kind of adaptive leadership you demonstrated in the Valley. You'll work with multiple units, helping them prepare for scenarios that standard training doesn't address." Andrea felt her pulse quicken as she processed the unexpected opportunity. "Ma'am, what would that position involve specifically?" "Teaching people to think beyond their assigned roles. Helping them develop the kind of comprehensive preparation that made your success possible. Essentially, institutionalizing the approach that everyone criticized until it saved their lives." The offer represented everything Andrea had hoped for: recognition, responsibility, and the opportunity to prove that emotional investment and tactical excellence could be combined effectively. But it also meant accepting a spotlight that she'd never sought, and responsibilities that would be scrutinized by critics looking for any evidence that her success had been situational rather than systematic. 6 weeks after the Medvednica Valley incident, Andrea stood in front of her first class of 24 peacekeeping personnel from various European commands, each selected because they demonstrated potential that their current assignments didn't fully utilize. The converted briefing room at Camp Marijan had been redesigned as a tactical training center, complete with terrain models, communication equipment, and detailed maps of the region's most challenging operational areas. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying new authority that still felt strange after months of being dismissed as an over-emotional supply driver. "I'm Specialist Wilson, and I'm here because 6 weeks ago, everyone thought I was inadequately prepared for anything beyond driving trucks. Today, we're going to discuss why that assessment was wrong and what it means for your own development." The faces looking back at her represented a cross-section of military personnel who'd been identified as having capabilities beyond their current roles. Some were logistics specialists like herself, others were communications technicians or administrative personnel who demonstrated tactical insights that their supervisors found surprising. All had been selected for what Colonel Voss termed the Adaptive Leadership Development Program, an experimental initiative that Andrea would design and implement. Lieutenant Sarah Kowalski, recently recovered from her head wounds and transferred from convoy operations, raised her hand. "Wilson, how do we know that your success wasn't just luck? One good day doesn't necessarily prove systematic capability." The question was fair and direct, exactly the kind of skepticism that Andrea had expected from experienced personnel, who'd seen promising initiatives fail when tested by operational realities. "Lieutenant, that's an excellent question," she replied. "Let me show you something that might provide perspective." Andrea activated the room's projection system, displaying a detailed timeline that began months before the Medvednica Valley ambush. "This is a record of my preparation activities from January through May. Map analysis, terrain studies, equipment acquisition, tactical scenario planning. Everything I did to prepare for situations that my official duties suggested I'd never encounter." The timeline was comprehensive and methodical, documenting hundreds of hours of self-directed study that had created expertise far beyond her assigned role. More importantly, it demonstrated that her tactical success had been built on systematic preparation rather than spontaneous inspiration or fortunate improvisation. "The point isn't that I'm exceptionally talented," Andrea continued. "The point is that dedicated preparation can develop capabilities that exceed official training programs. Everyone in this room has the potential to become more effective than their current assignment suggest." Quote, Sergeant Torres from the Spanish contingent leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Wilson, with respect, not everyone has the time or inclination to spend their off-duty hours studying tactical manuals and acquiring unauthorized equipment. Most of us have lives outside the military." "Sergeant, you're absolutely right," Andrea acknowledged. "But you're also here because your supervisors noticed that you think strategically about problems that aren't officially your responsibility. The question is whether you want to develop those instincts systematically or continue letting them remain unused potential." The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental challenge she faced in institutionalizing adaptive leadership. Military organizations were structured around specialization and clearly defined roles. But complex operational environments required personnel who could think and act beyond narrow job descriptions. Her program needed to encourage broader thinking without undermining necessary discipline and chain of command. Captain Elena Reyes from the Italian peacekeeping force asked the question that everyone was thinking: how do we balance initiative with following orders? Your success came from ignoring direct commands. Are we supposed to teach people to be insubordinate? Andrea had wrestled with this question throughout the development of her curriculum. "Captain, I think the key is understanding the difference between tactical initiative and insubordination. When I ignored orders to maintain position, I was making a tactical decision based on information that my commanders didn't have. The goal wasn't to undermine authority, but to achieve mission success when standard procedures were inadequate. She displayed a new slide showing decision-making frameworks that could help personnel evaluate when initiative was appropriate and when following orders was essential. The question isn't whether to follow commands, but how to provide commanders with the information and options they need to make effective decisions. Sometimes that means expanding your understanding beyond your assigned role. The 3-week course she'd designed combined theoretical instruction with practical exercises that simulated the kind of complex scenarios where adaptive thinking proved essential. Students learned advanced map reading, tactical communication, emergency medical procedures, and crisis decision-making, but always within a framework that emphasized supporting rather than circumventing command authority. Private Jensen from the Danish contingent raised his hand during the 2nd week of instruction. "Wilson, I've been thinking about what you said about emotional investment being a strength rather than a weakness. Can you explain how that works in practice?" Andrea smiled, recognizing an opportunity to address one of the core issues that had shaped her own experience. "Jensen, think about why you joined peacekeeping operations. Was it just for career advancement or because you wanted to make a difference in conflict situations?" "I wanted to help people," Jensen replied without hesitation. "I thought peacekeeping could prevent the kind of violence that destroyed my grandfather's village during World War II. That emotional connection to mission success is exactly what I'm talking about," Andrea explained. "It motivates you to prepare more thoroughly, to think more creatively about problems, to persist when situations become difficult. The military sometimes treats emotional investment as a liability, but it's actually a force multiplier that makes everything else more effective." The program's practical exercises were designed to test this theory under controlled conditions. Students faced simulated crises that required them to synthesize information from multiple sources, communicate effectively under pressure, and make decisions with incomplete data. The scenarios deliberately placed them in situations where their official training was insufficient and creative problem-solving was essential. Lieutenant Morrison from the British contingent struggled initially with the expanded responsibilities that the course demanded. "Wilson, this is overwhelming," she admitted after a particularly challenging simulation. "I'm trained to follow procedures and execute orders. This program is asking me to think like a commander when I'm nowhere near that level of experience." "Morrison, that's exactly the point," Andrea replied. "You don't need command authority to think strategically about mission success. You need to understand how your actions contribute to larger objectives, and how you can support those objectives more effectively." Yesterday's simulation showed that you noticed tactical problems that the designated leader missed. That's not overstepping your authority. It's providing valuable input that improves overall effectiveness. By the end of the 3-week program, the 24 students had developed capabilities that their previous assignments had never required or recognized. More importantly, they'd learned to see themselves as comprehensive contributors rather than narrow specialists, capable of adapting to unexpected situations while maintaining military discipline and effective chain of command. The final exercise was a complex scenario that recreated the essential elements of the Medvednica Valley ambush, but with multiple possible solutions that required coordinated responses from personnel with different specialties. Andrea watched as her students applied the adaptive thinking principles she'd taught them, improvising solutions that combined individual initiative with collective effectiveness. As the course concluded, Andrea realized that she'd accomplished something more significant than teaching tactical skills. She'd helped 24 military personnel recognize and develop capabilities they hadn't known they possessed, transforming them from narrow specialists into adaptive leaders who could contribute to mission success in unexpected ways. The program's success would be measured not by test scores or graduation ceremonies, but by how effectively these personnel performed when they returned to their units and faced real operational challenges. Andrea had given them tools and perspectives that would serve them throughout their military careers, but more importantly, she'd proven that adaptive leadership could be taught and institutionalized without undermining military effectiveness. The success of Andrea's pilot program at Camp Marijan triggered a cascade of requests from peacekeeping commands across Europe and beyond. Within 3 months, she found herself traveling between bases in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Mali, conducting abbreviated versions of her adaptive leadership course for personnel who'd been identified as having underutilized potential. Each location presented unique challenges that forced her to refine her methods and adapt her curriculum to different cultural and operational contexts. Her reputation had evolved from the supply driver who saved a convoy to, quote, the specialist who's revolutionizing personnel development. But Andrea remained focused on the practical impact of her work rather than the growing recognition. She measured success by the performance improvements of her students and the reduction in casualties among units that had implemented her training methods. The briefing room at Camp Marijan in Kosovo was packed beyond capacity when she arrived for her fourth major presentation to senior commanders from NATO peacekeeping forces. Lieutenant General Patricia Hawkins, the operations commanding officer, had specifically requested a comprehensive analysis of how adaptive leadership training could be integrated into standard peacekeeping curricula. Specialist Wilson, General Hawkins began, "Your program has generated considerable interest at the highest levels of military command. We're here because multiple units report improved performance after implementing your training methods. However, we need to understand whether these improvements are sustainable and scalable across diverse operational environments." Andrea had anticipated this level of scrutiny and prepared accordingly. Her presentation included detailed performance metrics from units that had participated in her training, showing measurable improvements in mission effectiveness, casualty reduction, and personnel satisfaction. More importantly, she documented specific examples of how adaptive thinking had prevented or mitigated operational failures. General, the key principle is that comprehensive preparation and flexible thinking can be developed through systematic training, she explained, displaying before and after performance data from her pilot program participants. Students who complete the course demonstrate improved situational awareness, enhanced decision-making under pressure, and better integration of individual capabilities with unit objectives. Colonel James Mitchell from the Canadian Peacekeeping Command raised a concern that had been voiced at multiple levels of military leadership. "Wilson, there's still significant resistance to this approach from commanders who worry that encouraging initiative will undermine discipline and chain of command. How do we address those concerns while implementing your methods?" The question touched on the fundamental tension that Andrea had navigated throughout her career, balancing individual initiative with military structure. "Colonel, the program specifically emphasizes that adaptive thinking should support rather than circumvent command authority. Students learn to provide commanders with better information and more effective options, not to make independent decisions that bypass established hierarchy." She displayed case studies from recent peacekeeping operations where her training graduates had successfully applied adaptive thinking principles while maintaining strict adherence to chain of command. In each example, individual initiative had enhanced rather than undermined unit effectiveness and command authority. Brigadier General Sarah Olsson from the Swedish forces asked about the program's applicability to different military cultures and operational environments. "Wilson, your methods were developed in the context of European peacekeeping operations. How do we know they'll be effective in different cultural contexts or more intense combat situations?" Andrea had spent considerable time researching this question, consulting with military anthropologists and combat veterans from various conflicts. "General, the fundamental principles are universal: thorough preparation, emotional investment in mission success, and flexible problem solving. The specific applications vary depending on cultural and operational context, but the underlying methodology has proven effective across diverse environments." She presented data from her recent work in Mali, where she'd adapted her curriculum for units operating in desert environments with different tactical challenges and cultural considerations. The core principles remained constant, but the practical applications had been modified to address specific regional threats and operational requirements. The most significant validation came from an unexpected source. Major Eric Johansson, her former commanding officer at Camp Marijan, had been invited to provide an independent assessment of her program's impact on unit effectiveness. "Generals, I was initially skeptical of Specialist Wilson's methods," Johansson admitted. Her approach challenged traditional assumptions about role specialization and personnel development. But the results speak for themselves. Units that have implemented her training demonstrate measurably improved performance across multiple operational metrics. He presented comparative data showing that units with adaptive leadership training experienced 40% fewer operational failures, 30% reduction in personnel injuries, and significantly higher mission success rates compared to control groups using standard training protocols. "The most important change," Johansson continued, is cultural. Personnel who complete Wilson's program demonstrate increased engagement with mission objectives and enhanced willingness to contribute beyond their minimum assigned responsibilities. They become force multipliers rather than narrow specialists. Lieutenant General Hawkins asked the question that would determine the program's future institutional support. Wilson, if we were to implement your methods across NATO peacekeeping forces, what would be the resource requirements and timeline for effective implementation? Andrea had prepared comprehensive implementation plans for exactly this scenario. General, the program can be scaled through a train-the-trainer model that creates certified instructors within each command. Initial implementation would require 6 months for instructor certification, followed by unit-by-unit training that could be completed within 18 months for most major commands. The cost-benefit analysis she presented was compelling. Relatively modest training investments would yield significant improvements in operational effectiveness and personnel safety. More importantly, the program would create a more adaptable and resilient peacekeeping force, capable of responding effectively to the increasingly complex challenges of modern conflict environments. The discussion continued for 3 hours, with detailed questions about quality control, standardization, cultural adaptation, and integration with existing training programs. Throughout the session, Andrea maintained focus on practical outcomes rather than theoretical benefits, providing concrete examples of how adaptive leadership training had prevented operational failures and saved lives. As the briefing concluded, General Hawkins made an announcement that would transform Andrea's experimental program into official NATO doctrine. Based on this presentation and supporting data, I'm recommending full implementation of adaptive leadership training across NATO peacekeeping commands. Specialist Wilson, congratulations, you've just revolutionized how we develop military personnel. The official recognition was gratifying, but Andrea's satisfaction came from knowing that thousands of peacekeeping personnel would now receive training that could save their lives and improve their effectiveness. Her journey from overlooked supply driver to military innovation leader had proven that individual initiative, properly channeled, could create systematic improvements that benefited entire organizations. But success also brought new challenges. As her program gained official status, she would need to navigate the bureaucratic complexities of institutional implementation while maintaining the adaptive thinking and flexible problem-solving that had made the training effective in the first place. The transformation was complete. Andrea Wilson had evolved from someone whose capabilities were underestimated to someone whose methods would shape military training for years to come. Her emotional investment in mission success and personnel safety had become the foundation for systematic improvements in military effectiveness. 2 years after the Medvednica Valley incident, Andrea stood in the same briefing room at Camp Marijan, where she'd once been relegated to equipment manifests while others planned crucial missions. But everything had changed. The walls now displayed certificates recognizing the base's role in developing NATO's adaptive leadership training program, and the morning briefing she was about to conduct would involve personnel from 12 different nations who'd come to learn her methods. Captain Andrea Wilson, she'd been promoted twice in 18 months, watched through the window as the Croatian sunrise painted the same golden streaks across the Pannonian plains that had marked the beginning of her most challenging day. The landscape looked identical, but she saw it now through eyes trained to recognize tactical opportunities and potential threats that her younger self had studied in secret. "Ma'am, the international delegation is ready for your briefing," announced Lieutenant Sarah Kowalski, her former Convoy colleague, who'd requested transfer to the Adaptive Leadership Program after completing her recovery from the ambush injuries. The relationship between them had evolved from casual acquaintance to professional partnership, united by their shared understanding of how quickly routine missions could become life-or-death situations. The briefing room was filled with senior officers from European peacekeeping commands, American special operations trainers, and civilian academics who studied military innovation. Andrea had grown comfortable with this level of attention, though she still preferred tactical discussions to theoretical presentations about organizational change and leadership development. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from proven success rather than inherited rank. "Today marks the second anniversary of an incident that began as a catastrophic ambush and ended as a case study in adaptive thinking. I'd like to share what we've learned about developing capabilities that exceed official job descriptions." The presentation that followed was both personal narrative and professional analysis, weaving together her individual journey with broader insights about military effectiveness and personnel development. She described the months of unauthorized preparation that had enabled her tactical success, but focused primarily on how those methods had been systematized and taught to thousands of peacekeeping personnel. Colonel Elena Reyes, now commanding the Italian Peacekeeping Training Center, raised her hand during the question period. Captain Wilson, your program has been implemented across NATO forces with remarkable success, but critics still argue that encouraging individual initiative risks undermining military discipline. How do you respond to those concerns? Andrea had heard this criticism countless times and developed responses based on operational data rather than theoretical arguments. Colonel, we now have 2 years of performance metrics from units using adaptive leadership training compared to control groups using traditional methods. The data shows that units with our training actually demonstrate superior discipline and chain of command adherence, because personnel understand how their individual capabilities contribute to collective mission success. She displayed comprehensive statistics showing reduced disciplinary incidents, improved mission completion rates, and enhanced unit cohesion among troops who'd completed adaptive leadership training. The numbers were compelling. Encouraging tactical thinking didn't undermine military structure, but actually strengthened it by creating more engaged and effective personnel. General Patricia Hawkins, who'd championed the program's NATO adoption, asked about future developments. Captain, where do you see this training methodology evolving over the next 5 years? What improvements or expansions are you considering? Quote, Andrea had spent considerable time thinking about the program's long-term potential and applications beyond military contexts. General, we're exploring applications for civilian emergency responders, disaster relief organizations, and international development agencies. The core principles, comprehensive preparation, emotional investment, and adaptive problem-solving, are relevant anywhere people face complex challenges with insufficient resources. The most gratifying moment came when Major Eric Johansson, now a colonel commanding peacekeeping operations in West Africa, provided his assessment of the program's impact. 2 years ago, I nearly court-martialed Captain Wilson for insubordination, he said with a slight smile. Today, her training methods have become standard doctrine because they work. She's proven that the military's most valuable resource isn't equipment or technology, but personnel who are thoroughly prepared and emotionally committed to mission success. After the formal briefing, Andrea walked to the exact spot where she'd stood 2 years earlier, watching the sunrise while nursing cold coffee and contemplating another routine supply run. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd returned to the same geographical location, but occupied a completely different position in terms of authority, responsibility, and recognition. Rachel Morgan, now a major herself and second in command of the Adaptive Leadership Program, joined her at the window. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd just followed orders that day? She asked. Andrea considered the question carefully. I think about all the personnel who might have died if I hadn't acted, she replied. But I also think about all the people who've benefited from the training program that grew out of that experience. Sometimes individual actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate situation. That afternoon, she received a message that brought her full circle in the most unexpected way. Private Jensen, one of her first training program graduates, had been involved in a complex peacekeeping situation in Mali, where his adaptive leadership skills had prevented a humanitarian crisis. His after-action report specifically credited the preparation methods and flexible thinking he'd learned in her course. The message reminded Andrea that her true measure of success wasn't personal recognition or career advancement, but the improved performance and enhanced safety of personnel who'd applied her training methods in real operational environments. Every successful mission, every life saved, every crisis averted through adaptive thinking represented validation of the principles she'd developed through months of unauthorized study and one desperate day in a Croatian valley. As evening approached, Andrea prepared for her next challenge, a deployment to establish adaptive leadership training programs in combat zones where the stakes were even higher and the margin for error even smaller. The methods she'd developed in the relative safety of peacekeeping operations would now be tested in environments where tactical innovation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Standing in the same briefing room, where she'd once been dismissed as too emotional for real military responsibility, Captain Andrea Wilson smiled as she planned training programs that would help thousands of personnel exceed their official limitations and contribute to mission success in ways that bureaucratic job descriptions could never anticipate. 5 years after the Medvednica Valley incident, Andrea found herself in a remote outpost in Afghanistan, watching a newly graduated class of her adaptive leadership program face their first real-world test. The situation was complex. A convoy carrying medical supplies to isolated villages had been diverted to assist with an emergency evacuation, requiring personnel to operate far beyond their standard roles and training. Colonel Andrea Wilson, her third promotion, had come with command of the International Adaptive Leadership Training Center, observed from the Operations Center as her former students coordinated a multifaceted response that would have been impossible under traditional military specialization. Supplies specialists were providing tactical advice, communications technicians were conducting medical triage, and logistics personnel were improvising solutions to problems that hadn't existed in any training manual. "Ma'am, the convoy has successfully extracted 37 civilians from the flood zone," reported Major Chen, her deputy commander who'd been among the first international officers to complete the Advanced Adaptive Leadership course. "Zero casualties. Minimal equipment loss. Mission accomplished through creative problem-solving and flexible role adaptation." Andrea nodded with satisfaction, but her attention was focused on the broader implications of what she was witnessing. The personnel coordinating this successful operation weren't elite special forces or seasoned combat veterans. They were ordinary military personnel who'd been taught to think beyond their assigned roles and prepare for situations that their job descriptions suggested they'd never encounter. The communications center buzzed with reports from similar operations worldwide. In Somalia, a maintenance team had successfully negotiated the release of hostages using psychological techniques learned in adaptive leadership training. In Syria, medical personnel had prevented a tactical disaster by recognizing and reporting insurgent movement patterns that intelligence specialists had missed. In Colombia, logistics coordinators had improvised a disaster relief operation that saved hundreds of lives during an earthquake. Each success story validated the core principle that had driven Andrea's original unauthorized preparation. Comprehensive readiness and emotional investment in mission success could enable anyone to contribute beyond their official limitations. The systematic training program she'd developed had transformed individual potential into collective capability, creating military units that were more flexible, more effective, and more resilient than traditional specialized organizations. "Colonel, we've received a request from the United Nations to establish adaptive leadership training for civilian peacekeeping organizations," Major Chen continued. "They've studied our military applications and want to explore how the same principles might improve humanitarian operations and disaster response." The request represented another evolution in the program's scope and impact. What had begun as Andrea's personal preparation for convoy security had grown into military doctrine, and now it was expanding into civilian applications where the stakes were measured in lives saved rather than tactical victories achieved. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kowalski, now commanding the European Training Division, joined the conversation via video conference from her headquarters in Brussels. "Andrea, we've just completed analysis of 5 years of operational data. Units with adaptive leadership training demonstrate 60% fewer operational failures, 45% reduction in personnel casualties, and 80% improvement in mission success rates compared to traditionally trained units." The statistics were impressive, but Andrea's real satisfaction came from the individual stories behind those numbers. Thousands of military personnel had discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed, transforming from narrow specialists into adaptive leaders who could contribute to mission success in unexpected ways. More importantly, they'd learned to see emotional investment and tactical flexibility as strengths rather than weaknesses. "The most significant change," Kowalski continued, "is cultural. Personnel who complete our training report higher job satisfaction, greater sense of purpose, and enhanced confidence in their ability to handle unexpected challenges. We're not just improving tactical performance, we're developing better soldiers and better people." Andrea's thoughts drifted to her original convoy colleagues, many of whom had become advocates for adaptive leadership training after witnessing its effectiveness firsthand. Sergeant Muller now served as a senior instructor, teaching convoy operations with emphasis on flexible thinking and comprehensive preparation. Private Jensen had established training programs for Scandinavian peacekeeping forces, adapting Andrea's methods for Arctic operational environments. The program's success had also attracted critics who argued that encouraging initiative and emotional investment risked undermining traditional military discipline and hierarchy. But operational data consistently demonstrated the opposite. Units with adaptive leadership training actually showed superior discipline and chain of command adherence, because personnel understood how their individual contributions supported collective objectives. "Colonel, we've received an interesting request," Major Chen announced, consulting a message that had just arrived through secure channels. "Hollywood producers want to make a film about your story, focusing on how individual determination can overcome institutional limitations." Andrea smiled at the irony. Her journey from overlooked supply driver to military innovator had become the kind of inspirational narrative that entertainment industry loved, but she remained focused on practical outcomes rather than popular recognition. "Tell them I'm honored by the interest, but my priority is expanding training programs rather than promoting personal stories." That evening, as she reviewed progress reports from training centers on 4 continents, Andrea reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her from a converted farmhouse in Croatia to leadership of an international military training program. Her unauthorized cliff climb to save a wounded pilot had evolved into systematic methods for developing human potential within military organizations. The most rewarding aspect of her work wasn't the recognition or authority, but the knowledge that her experience had created opportunities for others to exceed their limitations and contribute to mission success in ways that conventional wisdom suggested were impossible. Every successful operation, every life saved, every crisis averted through adaptive thinking represented validation of the principle that had driven her original preparation. Being ready for unexpected challenges was the foundation of military effectiveness. Her communication device chimed with an urgent message from peacekeeping headquarters. Another complex situation was developing, requiring immediate deployment of adaptive leadership specialists to coordinate international response efforts. Andrea began preparing for departure, knowing that somewhere in the world, personnel she'd trained were already applying flexible thinking and comprehensive preparation to solve problems that standard procedures couldn't address. 10 years after a young supply driver named Andrea Wilson ignored direct orders to save her convoy in a Croatian valley, the principles she'd discovered through unauthorized preparation and desperate improvisation had transformed how military organizations worldwide approached personnel development and tactical training. Standing in the Pentagon briefing room where she'd been invited to address the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Andrea Wilson reflected on a journey that had redefined the relationship between individual initiative and institutional effectiveness. "Generals, the data speaks for itself," she began, displaying comprehensive statistics from a decade of adaptive leadership implementation across 43 countries and multiple military organizations. "Personnel who complete our training programs demonstrate superior performance across every metric that matters: mission success, casualty reduction, operational flexibility, and unit cohesion." Quote, the presentation that followed was both vindication and expansion of everything she'd learned during those months of secret study at Camp Marijan. What had begun as personal preparation for convoy security had evolved into systematic methods for developing human potential within complex organizations. The principles were universal: comprehensive preparation, emotional investment in mission success, and flexible problem-solving could enable anyone to contribute beyond their official limitations. General Michael Harrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, asked the question that would determine the program's future integration with American military doctrine. "General Wilson, your methods have proven effective in peacekeeping and stability operations, but how do we know they'll be equally valuable in high-intensity conflict situations, where split-second decisions determine survival?" Andrea had anticipated this concern and prepared accordingly. "General, our training has been tested in every major conflict zone of the past decade. From counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan to humanitarian crises in Haiti, personnel using adaptive leadership principles consistently outperform traditionally trained units when facing unexpected challenges and complex operational environments." She displayed case studies from recent combat operations where her training graduates had prevented tactical disasters through creative problem-solving and comprehensive preparation. In each example, individual initiative had enhanced rather than undermined unit effectiveness and command authority. The most compelling testimony came from an unexpected source. Colonel Eric Johansson, now commanding Special Operations Training for NATO forces, had been invited to provide independent assessment of the program's military value. "Generals, 10 years ago I nearly court-martialed then Specialist Wilson for ignoring orders and conducting unauthorized combat operations," he said with evident admiration. "Today, her training methods are standard doctrine across Allied forces because they work. She's proven that emotional investment and tactical flexibility aren't incompatible with military discipline, but actually enhance it." The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Military units with adaptive leadership training showed 70% fewer operational failures, 50% reduction in personnel casualties, and 85% improvement in mission success rates compared to control groups using traditional training methods. More importantly, the program had created a cultural shift that valued comprehensive preparation and flexible thinking as essential military capabilities. Admiral Susan Chen asked about the program's expansion into civilian applications. General, we understand that your methods are being adopted by emergency responders, disaster relief organizations, and international development agencies. What does this suggest about the broader applicability of military training principles? Andrea had spent considerable time developing civilian applications of adaptive leadership training, working with organizations that faced complex challenges requiring creative solutions and coordinated responses. Admiral, the core principles are universal. Whether you're coordinating disaster relief or conducting military operations, success depends on personnel who are thoroughly prepared, emotionally invested in positive outcomes, and capable of adapting to unexpected situations. The briefing continued for 2 hours, with detailed discussions about implementation timelines, resource requirements, and integration with existing training programs. Throughout the session, Andrea maintained focus on practical outcomes rather than theoretical benefits, providing concrete examples of how adaptive thinking had prevented failures and saved lives in operational environments. As the formal presentation concluded, General Harrison made an announcement that would institutionalize everything Andrea had worked to achieve. Based on this comprehensive review, the Joint Chiefs are recommending full integration of adaptive leadership training across all branches of the U.S. military. General Wilson, you've revolutionized how we develop and utilize human potential in military organizations. After the briefing, Andrea walked through Arlington National Cemetery, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from dismissed supply driver to senior military leader. The white headstones stretched endlessly across perfectly maintained grounds, each representing someone who'd served with dedication and sacrifice. She thought about the personnel whose lives had been saved through adaptive leadership training, the missions that had succeeded because of flexible thinking, the crises that had been averted through comprehensive preparation. Her phone buzzed with a message from Major Jensen, now commanding adaptive leadership programs for United Nations peacekeeping operations. General, just wanted you to know that yesterday's humanitarian operation in Yemen succeeded because a supply sergeant remembered your training about thinking beyond assigned roles. 43 civilians evacuated safely, 0 casualties. Your principles are still saving lives. The message encapsulated everything Andrea valued about her work. Personal recognition and career advancement were satisfying, but her true measure of success remained the improved performance and enhanced safety of personnel who applied her training methods in real operational environments. That evening, she received an unexpected call from Private Jessica Martinez, a young logistics specialist stationed at a remote outpost in Afghanistan. General Wilson, I wanted to thank you for the adaptive leadership training. Yesterday, my convoy was ambushed, and I used your preparation methods to coordinate a successful counterattack. Everyone made it home safely. The call brought Andrea full circle, connecting her current position with the desperate young supply driver who'd climbed a cliff face to save her wounded pilot. The principles remained constant. Comprehensive preparation, emotional investment, and adaptive thinking could enable anyone to exceed their limitations and contribute to mission success when conventional approaches proved insufficient. As she prepared for her next assignment, establishing adaptive leadership training for coalition forces in the Pacific Theater, General Andrea Wilson smiled at the recognition that her unauthorized study sessions and desperate improvisation had created systematic improvements in military effectiveness that would benefit personnel for generations to come. Her legacy wasn't the promotions or recognition, but the thousands of military personnel who'd learned to see emotional investment and tactical flexibility as strengths rather than weaknesses. Every successful mission, every life saved, every crisis averted through adaptive thinking represented validation of the principle that had driven her from the beginning. Being ready for unexpected challenges was the foundation of military effectiveness and human potential. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Somewhere in the world, personnel she'd trained were applying comprehensive preparation and flexible thinking to solve problems that standard procedures couldn't address, proving every day that individual initiative, properly channeled, could create systematic improvements that saved lives and achieved mission success. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.